You wake to the chill of stone beneath your bare feet. The torchlight flickers, casting long shadows across the chamber walls, where ancient tapestries sag with the weight of dust and centuries. The air is damp with the scent of old wool and time. Your heart hammers like a blacksmith's forge, each beat echoing in the silence, broken only by the distant howl of wind through narrow arrow slits. You are 12 years old, slender as a reed, clothed in a gown of stiff brocade that scratches your skin. Its embroidery gleams like captured moonlight, yet weighs you down like the chains of duty. The door creaks open. In steps a man twice your age, his breath sour with wine from the feast below, his eyes shadowed not by lust, but by the burden of kingdoms. This is no dream of love. This is your wedding night. In another world, children your age chase geese across muddy courtyards or braid daisies into garlands. But you, a girl born into nobility, are currency. Tonight, your body becomes a seal on an alliance forged in ink and blood. You are not just a bride, you are a vessel for heirs yet unborn, for treaties yet signed. And failure? It whispers like the draft beneath the castle door. Failure means annulment, disgrace, exile, or worse, the agony of a childbed that could claim your life before dawn. Before we dive into these forgotten stories, tales not of princesses in towers, but of survival behind veils and vows, take a moment. If you find yourself drawn to history's hidden truths, consider subscribing. Let us journey together into the dim candlelight of the past, across oceans and empires, where hearts beat in silence beneath crowns of gold and sorrow. Imagine now the flicker of a single tallow candle. Its flame sputters, battling draughts that seep through the cracks in the mortar of a castle built before your ancestors were born. In its dim glow, a girl named Matilda stands frozen. Her small hands grip the edge of a wooden chest carved with imperial eagles. Born around the year 1102 in the royal court of England, she has known since her earliest memories that her life is not her own. To her father, King Henry I of England, she is not a daughter to cherish, but a pawn, a means to secure power, to solidify alliances stretching from the misted shores of Normandy to the mountain fortresses of the Holy Roman Empire. She is not exceptional for her time. She is typical, one of hundreds of noble girls promised away in childhood, dispatched to foreign lands, spoken of in treaties before they learn to write their own name. But Matilda's story is not typical in one key way. She would eventually dare to claim what women were never meant to hold, a crown in her own right. But not yet. For now, she is still a child, and outside the chapel walls, beyond the thick velvet curtains of her bridal chamber, Europe watches with calculating eyes. For tonight is not just a wedding, it is a transaction sealed in flesh. The fear coils tight in her stomach. Not just the fear of pain or shame, but the fear of becoming invisible, of being remembered not for her voice, but for her womb, of being erased by history, her body used and her name forgotten. But history did not forget her, and neither shall we. Long before the crimson gown, before the cathedral vows and the silent agony of a bridal bed, Matilda was already spoken for. Her birth was not an event marked by lullabies or soft whispers of affection, but by calculation. Born around 1102 AD in the royal halls of England, her cradle lay beneath a ceiling of ambition. Her father, King Henry I, ruled a realm stretched like a tapestry from the cliffs of Dover to the stone fortresses of Normandy. Every daughter born into such power was a thread to be woven into Europe's political fabric. At just 7 years old, when most children are still stumbling over their prayers or pressing wax seals into soft wax for amusement, Matilda was already part of an imperial design. In 1109 AD, emissaries from the Holy Roman Empire arrived at the English court, cloaked in formality and diplomacy, bearing a proposal not of love, but of strategy. The man they represented was Emperor Henry V, battle-hardened, ambitious, and nearly 3 times her age. He needed not a companion, but a connection, and Matilda, barely beyond her 6th winter, was the price of unity. On the 10th of April, 1110, the betrothal was sealed in the city of Utrecht. There were no fireworks, no soft romantic overtures, just ink on parchment and nods of approval from advisors and archbishops. The child was summoned, her future now bound to a foreign emperor she had never met. Before her small hands could even steady a quill, she was handed a destiny forged in steel and Latin script. She crossed the English Channel not as a daughter leaving home, but as a diplomatic offering. Germany greeted her not with open arms, but with expectations carved into its cathedrals and courtyards. The forests were denser, the air sharper with the scent of pine and iron. The clang of blacksmiths echoed through the stone towns, constant reminders that this was a land at war, a land ruled by might. Placed under the guardianship of Archbishop Bruno of Trier, Matilda was not allowed the softness of childhood. Her days were filled with lessons, harsh German consonants echoing against monastery walls, embroidered silks to perfect her courtly image, and prayers that stretched long into the cold dawn. She learned the Holy Roman customs, their rigid hierarchies, the reverent rituals that crowned emperors and crushed dissent. But beyond Latin verses and imperial etiquette, a quiet dread took root. No one explained it plainly. No one dared. But beneath the layers of velvet and the weight of foreign jewels, she knew in the space between whispered conversations and sidelong glances that she was being prepared for something far more intimate and inescapable than politics. Even in her private prayers, whispered to the stone saints that lined the chapel, she could not form the words to name it. She was to be a wife, a consort, a mother to the empire's future. But what did that mean for a girl, not yet a woman? What did it mean to surrender her body to a stranger's touch, to lie beneath a man whose authority was absolute? These were not fears she could voice. In the empire's eyes, she was a future empress, a link between two thrones. But in her own eyes, behind the polished manners and measured bows, she was still a child, frightened, homesick, and utterly alone. She learned early that privacy was a myth in royal life, that behind every curtain, eyes watched, that even her marriage bed would be a matter of public interest, a performance to confirm her purity and her husband's virility. The weight of these expectations, cloaked in silence and ceremony, settled on her slender shoulders long before the wedding bells ever tolled. And still, she endured. As Europe prepared to witness the grand union between England and the Empire, Matilda prepared to give up what little of herself remained untouched. A name, a body, a childhood, all to be folded into a legacy she did not choose. But though history called her the Empress, it would not be her crown alone that made her unforgettable. It would be her defiance in the years to come. Yet for now, she was simply a girl in a foreign land, wrapped in velvet, walking toward a fate she could not escape. The winter sun rose pale over the city of Mainz on the 7th of January, 1114. Ice clung to the cathedral stones like the breath of angels, and smoke from braziers curled into the frigid sky. Inside, the great nave swelled with nobles from across the empire, their cloaks trimmed in fur, their blades polished, their eyes watchful. For this was no ordinary union. It was the marriage of the Holy Roman Emperor to an English princess. It was a spectacle of might, of ceremony, and of calculated purpose. At the center of it all walked a girl of 12. Matilda's gown was crimson velvet, heavy with gold thread that rasped against her tender skin. It dragged behind her like a river of blood and empire, stitched not just by seamstresses, but by treaties and ambition. Her veil, sheer as mist, fell across her face, a gossamer curtain that separated her from the hundreds of eyes watching. They watched not for her smile or grace, but for signs that she understood her role, that she would bend, yield, become what the empire needed. The cathedral soared above her, its arches reaching like arms to heaven. Beneath those vaulted heavens, incense filled the air, thick, sweet, suffocating. Latin prayers echoed around her, ancient syllables meant to sanctify vows neither heart nor body could yet comprehend. She knew the words, she had studied them, but their meanings were like the stars, distant and cold. Henry V stood beside her, tall, scarred, and silent. His face bore the roughness of war campaigns against rebellious dukes, sleepless nights under canvas tents, and the weight of command. He was 28, she, a child. He took her hand. His grip was firm, not unkind, but unmistakably possessive. It was not a lover's touch. It was the gesture of ownership, the sealing of a pact. As the vows were spoken, the cathedral bells began to toll, deep, booming chimes that rolled down the Rhine valley, declaring to all that England and the Empire were now bound in flesh and in name. But the wedding was only the prologue. The procession to the imperial palace followed, winding through the streets where people strained to catch a glimpse of the girl empress. Her name was already becoming legend. She was the daughter of Henry of England, now the wife of a Caesar. In the halls of the palace, feasts unfolded: roasted boar, honeyed fruits, goblets of spiced wine raised to future heirs. Minstrels sang, and courtiers toasted, but beneath the revelry, the air crackled with something unspoken. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone pretended not to. That night, in a bedchamber lined with tapestries depicting triumphant battles and noble saints, Matilda faced the moment she had been groomed for since her 7th year. The linens were stripped and replaced, freshly warmed, prepared for ritual. Witnesses waited just beyond the door, servants, priests, chamberlains ready to confirm what would never be spoken aloud. That the marriage had been consummated, custom demanded proof. Her pulse thundered, her breath came shallow and quick. The cold air raised gooseflesh along her arms, but it was not just chill, it was dread. Henry approached. The smell of mead clung to him, and in his eyes was not cruelty, but entitlement. He was not an abuser, in the sense the word suggests now. He was a man of his time, raised to rule, to expect, to command. And what of her? No chronicler recorded her tears, no letter described her fear. Vulnerability had no place in imperial archives. But we can read between the lines, between the ceremonies and signatures, and we find a girl, a child, lying still under the weight of destiny. 12 years old, in the Empire's eyes, this night was a triumph. A new empress, a union sealed. But for Matilda, it marked the quiet death of childhood. She had entered the cathedral as a princess. She left that night with a crown and a scar no gold could hide. Years passed like footsteps in snow, soft at first, then vanished. Matilda grew into her title, not as a woman of joy or maternal warmth, but as a sovereign wrapped in ritual, draped in silks that often felt more like armor than ornament. By her early 20s, she had spent over a decade inside the Holy Roman Empire, at court, in council, in cathedrals echoing with the thunder of Gregorian chant. And yet, she remained a stranger to joy. The marriage, like so many royal matches, was rooted in necessity, not affection. The emperor, often absent and worn by war, ruled with steel rather than sentiment. Still, he did not mistreat her, he simply didn't see her. To Henry V, Matilda was a partner in power, an asset in robes, and yet, for all the alliances they cemented and ceremonies they performed, there were no children, no heirs, no tiny footfalls on stone corridors, no cry in the night to break the silence of their imperial halls. The empire watched, quietly. At first, with patience, then with unease. By the time Henry V died on May 23, 1125, in Utrecht, the whispers had long begun. Was it her fault? Was the English empress barren? Had she failed the most sacred of duties to birth a son, to secure the future? She was only 23. A widow. A woman in a man's world, her power derived not from her own body, but from the bodies she was expected to produce. Matilda returned to Normandy with little more than a gilded title, and the weight of failure pressing on her chest. She still bore the name Empress of the Romans, but it rang hollow in the English court. To the men who advised her father, she was both too much and not enough, too foreign, too proud, too barren, and yet also too valuable to discard. At court, she was watched, scrutinized, every glance toward her waistline, every moment she declined wine, every whispered word with a lady-in-waiting was interpreted through one cruel question. Could she still bear children? The silence in her chambers was deafening. No heir had come, no swelling belly to shield her from judgment. Whether from the emperor's health worn down by constant campaigning, or from her own young body still recovering from the trials of premature duty, the truth was irrelevant. The result was the same, nor child, nor legacy. In the late hours of those long nights, with only the rustle of silk and the flicker of the hearth, Matilda faced a fear that had haunted her since childhood, not just of pain or loss, but of being forgotten, of becoming a royal footnote, a failed empress, a widow returned home with nothing to show but a title that no longer opened doors. And yet, the world had misjudged her. That title, Empress, became her armor. It gave her dignity, even when her womb gave her none. She wore it like a shield, demanding the respect owed to a woman who had once stood beside an emperor. But under the surface, the scars ran deep. There is no record of her weeping, no diary to confess her inner grief, but history allows us to imagine. Alone in her father's court, childless, watched and weighed, Matilda must have felt a familiar dread return, the same dread she had carried into the Cathedral of Mainz, the same dread that whispered behind every embroidered veil, "If I do not bear sons, Am I still worth anything? But Matilda was not done. The story that would define her of struggle, of succession, of war was only beginning. And it would rise not from her womb, but from her will. Far from the grey skies of Normandy and the solemn cathedrals of the Empire, sunlight spilled across the hills of Aquitaine, warm and golden, thick with the scent of lavender and vineyards heavy with summer promise. It was here, in the court of Poitiers, that a different kind of noble daughter was raised, not in the cold shadow of kingship, but in the flowering cradle of culture, poetry, and power. Eleanor was born around 1122, the daughter of Duke William X of Aquitaine and Eleanor of Châtellerault. Her childhood was steeped not in Latin chants or imperial austerity, but in the lyric songs of troubadours and the bold colours of stained-glass chapels. Hers was a world alive with the arts, where courtly love was born, and a woman could be both muse and master. She inherited one of the richest duchies in Europe, stretching from the Pyrenees to the Loire, a jewel of territory that made her not just a bride-to-be, but a political earthquake waiting to happen. When her father died in 1137, Eleanor, at just 15, became the most eligible heiress on the continent. And with that inheritance came danger. She was not allowed a moment of vulnerability. Before rivals could lay claim to her lands through force or marriage, the French crown moved swiftly. King Louis VI, already dying, arranged her marriage to his son, Louis VII. It was a union forged not in love, but in strategy, a move to fold Aquitaine into the French realm through a wedding vow spoken under the watchful eyes of every noble in the land. On the 25th of July, 1137, in the Cathedral of Saint-André in Bordeaux, the wedding was solemnized. The summer heat clung to the stone walls, mingling with the aroma of beeswax candles and the crushed rushes strewn across the floor. Eleanor, radiant in a kirtle of sapphire blue silk embroidered with golden lions, stood at the altar like a vision of myth, and yet she was still a girl about to be handed to a kingdom. Louis VII, only 17, was pale, pious, and painfully unprepared for what lay ahead. Raised in the monastic tradition, he had been intended for the church, not the throne. He was devout, hesitant, more monk than monarch. As he placed the ring on Eleanor's finger, his hands trembled not with desire, but with doubt. Their union may have been sanctified by God and blessed by a kingdom, but it was fraught from the beginning. He was a man bound by austerity. She, a duchess who had grown up amidst poetry, falconry, and spirited independence. They were mismatched not in title, but in soul. That evening, the city celebrated with a feast befitting an empire. Roasted peacocks, wine poured from silver jugs, songs that soared into the rafters. But for Eleanor, the true performance lay beyond the banquet hall in the chamber prepared for the wedding night. A canopied bed awaited them, symbol of both duty and expectation. Dusk fell over the Garonne River, casting the city in golden shadow. Priests blessed the bedding. Courtiers toasted their fertility with goblets of Hippocras, a spiced wine said to stir desire. But Eleanor's heart beat not with excitement, but apprehension. Louis, awkward and inexperienced, approached her not as a man, but as a boy wearing a crown too large. His religious devotion warred with the physical demands of kingship. Chronicles suggest he recoiled from carnal pleasure, viewing it as sin even within marriage. What passed between them that night is undocumented, but its silence speaks volumes. Eleanor, curious yet cautious, had to navigate this strange intimacy. She understood that her worth now hinged on what her body could produce. Without sons, she would remain a duchess on loan, a temporary bride, not a queen with permanence, and the years to come would prove that fragility. 2 daughters were born, Marie in 1145 and Alex in 1150, but no sons. At the French court, whispers began. Whispers that Eleanor was too bold, too headstrong, too foreign. Her love of poetry clashed with Louis's silence. Her vibrant nature jarred against his self-denial. Yet it was not Eleanor who was cold, but the marriage itself, a slow frost creeping across their shared throne. In that candlelit chamber on her wedding night, Eleanor's fears had not been unfounded. She was a queen, yes, but one wrapped in silks that did not warm, beside a man who could not meet her eyes. She had entered the marriage with fire in her blood, and already she felt the chill of isolation settling in. In the gilded halls of Paris, Eleanor of Aquitaine soon discovered that queenship was not a crown of jewels, but of silence. Her marriage to Louis VII, blessed by priests and poets alike, had begun in ceremony and splendor, But what followed was a union shaped more by withdrawal than passion. Louis was a king of contradiction. Trained from boyhood for the cloister, his soul yearned for solitude, scripture, and salvation. Yet the death of his elder brother had dragged him from the monastery to the throne, replacing a life of contemplation with one of command, and though his crown glittered, his gaze often seemed to look inward toward heaven rather than toward her. For Eleanor, the contrast could not have been starker. She had grown up among the most cultivated courts in Europe. In Poitiers, women debated theology, and troubadours sang verses that dared to name desire. Eleanor had been taught that love could be art, that power could be subtle, and that a woman need not lower her eyes to be noble. But now, each morning, she woke beside a man who barely saw her. Their marriage was marked by obedience rather than intimacy. Louis treated Eleanor not cruelly, but distantly, his affections cloaked in duty, his touch hesitant, as if afraid that pleasure itself would taint him. He was a man haunted by his own virtue, torn between the carnal demands of kingship and the ascetic ideals drilled into him by abbots and monks. As queen, Eleanor's first and only commandment was to produce a son, but years passed and the cradle remained empty. It was not until 8 years into their marriage that their first daughter, Marie, was born. The court sighed with relief, but it was a muted celebration. Daughters, after all, were not heirs. And the pressure grew. Behind the scenes, court gossip tightened around Eleanor like a noose. She was too proud, they said, too opinionated, too Aquitainian. Some whispered she bewitched the king, others said she resisted him. The truth, as always, was more complicated and far more painful. Louis was a husband in name, but a monk in spirit. When he touched her, it was with the cautious hand of someone afraid of sin. When he kissed her, it was as if in apology. And Eleanor, fierce and alive, learned that desire unshared turns to loneliness. By the time their second daughter, Alex, was born in 1150, the emotional chasm between them had widened beyond repair. The absence of a male heir became a political threat. The Capetian dynasty hung precariously on a marriage where duty had replaced devotion, and hope had begun to rot into resentment. The Second Crusade, launched in 1147, offered them a temporary escape, or so it seemed. Eleanor joined Louis on the expedition to the Holy Land, an extraordinary act for a woman of her time. But instead of healing, Antioch became the place where their bond fractured entirely. Rumors swirled of her closeness to her uncle Raymond, of scandal behind silk-draped tents, but whether truth or slander, the damage was done. In 1152, at the Council of Beaugency, their marriage was annulled. Officially, the grounds were consanguinity. They were too closely related by blood, but everyone knew better. It was incompatibility not of lineage, but of spirit. Eleanor left the French court not in shame, but with a strange kind of liberation. She had given France her youth, her daughters, and her patience. It had not been enough. Yet in shedding the cold embrace of a man more priest than partner, she stepped into a new chapter. The fire within her had not dimmed, it had only been smothered, and soon it would burn bright enough to reshape kingdoms. March 1152. The halls of Beaugency murmured with Latin prayers and rustling parchment. Behind closed cathedral doors, the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII was formally dissolved. 14 years of union marked by pilgrimage, silence, and 2 daughters was ended with a few strokes of ecclesiastical ink. Consanguinity, the Church claimed, a convenient fiction. Louis and Eleanor were indeed cousins, but no more so than dozens of noble couples whose unions remained untouched. The truth was simpler and more human. The marriage had failed. He had wanted a saint. She had wanted a partner. Neither had received what they bargained for. As she departed the French court, Eleanor did not slink away in disgrace. She galloped toward destiny. Her next move would shock Europe. Within mere weeks, a new suitor arrived, not a hesitant monk king, but a fierce young duke with ambition carved into his bones, Henry of Anjou. 20 years old, rugged, relentless, and descended from the Plantagenet line, Henry was unlike any man Eleanor had known. Where Louis withdrew into prayer, Henry lunged toward power. Where the French king hesitated, the Angevin duke burned with urgency. On May 18, 1152, in the chapel of Poitiers, Eleanor married Henry. She was 30, he was 19. Their union was not just a spark, it was a wildfire. To some, the match was scandalous. A queen divorced weeks ago now, wedded to a man 11 years her junior. But Eleanor had never bowed to convention. She had tasted life at the center of European politics and refused to fade quietly into the shadows. She knew what she was doing and what Henry offered. With her, Henry gained Aquitaine, the richest duchy in France. With him, Eleanor gained a chance to reshape her fate. Together, they would forge an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. Within 2 years, Henry would be crowned King of England. Eleanor was now twice a queen and more powerful than ever. Their marriage, unlike her first, was fertile both politically and literally. Over the next 13 years, she bore 8 children, 5 sons and 3 daughters. Among them were names that would echo through history: Richard the Lionheart, Eleanor of Castile, and John, future king and villain of Magna Carta legend. Yet even in this union, passion did not guarantee peace. Henry, ever hungry for dominion, grew restless. He took mistresses, claimed lands, and even tried to divide power among their sons before their time. Eleanor, no stranger to courtly intrigue, found herself at odds not only with her husband, but eventually with her children as well. By the 1172nd, she was no longer just a duchess or a queen. She was a matriarch at the heart of a dynasty racked with betrayal. When Henry discovered that she had supported her sons in a rebellion against him, his response was swift. Eleanor was imprisoned. For 16 years, she remained under guard, queen, mother, and captive, but she endured. And when Henry died in 1189, it was Eleanor, now in her late 60s, who emerged once more into the political spotlight. She helped secure Richard's succession, governed in his absence during the Crusades, and brokered marriages across Europe. It had all begun with rejection, with the silent wedding bed in Bordeaux and the annulment at Beaugency. Yet from that pain, Eleanor had built an empire. She had turned abandonment into ascent. Her life defied every boundary set before her, from girlhood in Poitiers to the cold marriage halls of Paris, from the fiery court of Anjou to the thrones of England. Eleanor of Aquitaine remained unbroken. Even when the world tried to silence her, she answered with kingdoms. Long before Eleanor defied kings, another woman set fire to tradition, not with sword or crown, but with a single word: no. Matilda of Flanders was born around 1031 into one of Europe's most powerful merchant ducal courts. Her father, Baldwin V, was Count of Flanders. Her mother, Isabella, was a princess of France. The court of Bruges bustled with trade, diplomacy, and the ceaseless clatter of looms weaving the cloth that would wrap Europe's elite. But beneath the aroma of sea salt and dye vats, another currency flowed: bloodlines. Matilda, educated and high-born, was not just a daughter. She was leverage. Suitors came and went, but none captured her interest or her respect. Then came a name that would ripple through history: William, Duke of Normandy. William was no stranger to ambition, nor to insult. Born the illegitimate son of Duke Robert of Normandy and a tanner's daughter, his title of the bastard clung to him like a curse. And yet, through cunning, military strength, and sheer will, William had secured his place as duke. But legitimacy cannot be earned in the eyes of a noble court, it must be inherited. When he proposed to Matilda, she is said to have replied with disdain, "I will not marry a bastard." What followed became the stuff of legend. One version, embroidered by Norman chroniclers with the flair of myth, claims William rode to Bruges, found her in the street, dragged her from her horse by the hair, and beat her in the mud before riding off, leaving scandal and stunned courtiers in his wake. It is a tale soaked in violence, in masculine bravado, in the grim romance of medieval folklore, but historians doubt its truth. It smacks of propaganda, Norman writers casting their future queen as tamed, their duke as dominant. The real story is more complex and far more interesting. Matilda, it seems, was not cowed into submission. Her marriage to William came not from coercion, but calculation. She saw in him what others feared to admit, a man who would stop at nothing to carve a throne from the world's chaos. Yet their betrothal, around 1049, sparked immediate outcry from Rome. The church guardians of both spiritual purity and political control declared the union unlawful. They were distant cousins, and under the laws of consanguinity, such a marriage threatened the soul and the state. Pope Leo IX himself forbade it at the Council of Reims. But William, ever relentless, did not back down, and Matilda stood with him. They waited. Perhaps their wedding occurred in 1051, in the town of Eu in Normandy, likely a small, quiet ceremony, tucked into the folds of Defiance. There were no trumpets, no royal blessings, only two wills refusing to be undone. That night, beneath the flicker of hearth flames and the stone walls of a remote chapel, their marriage was consummated in secret, shadowed by the spectre of excommunication. Matilda, wrapped in Flemish linen scented with lavender sachets, faced not just the unfamiliarity of a new husband, but the threat of spiritual condemnation. Would the Pope's curse render their children illegitimate? Would their unborn dynasty be a scandal in the eyes of both God and men? Yet they did not flinch. In time, they made peace with the Church not through apology, but through piety. In 1059, Pope Nicholas II issued a dispensation, lifting the ban. But it came at a price. William and Matilda were to found two great abbeys in Caen, one for men, one for women. A compromise built not on guilt, but grandeur. And children did come, at least 9, perhaps 10. Among them, William Rufus and Henry, future kings of England. Matilda's womb, once shadowed by papal judgment, became the fountainhead of a new ruling house. But the fire that had defined their early marriage never truly dimmed. She was not a docile duchess. When William launched his invasion of England in 1066, Matilda governed Normandy in his absence, her seal pressed onto charters, her will etched into law. She was a partner in conquest, not in name, but in deed. Still, the fears of that wedding night, the fear of rejection, of sin, of failure never fully left her. Even years later, when they quarreled over their rebellious son Robert Curthose, echoes of that original tension returned. Love, duty, and legacy are never simple when thrones are at stake. Matilda of Flanders died in 1083 at Caen, in the same city where their abbeys stood as monuments to their once forbidden love. Her death shattered William. The conqueror of England, the man who had bent nations to his will, was undone not by war, but by grief. He died 4 years later, and was buried apart from her. And yet, their story endures, not just in stone or bloodline, but in the memory of a woman who once dared to say no and a man who, for all his fury and force, never forgot her. Their wedding had been whispered, not heralded. The vows exchanged not in the glow of royal approval, but under the looming disapproval of Rome. Matilda of Flanders and William of Normandy had bound their lives together in a union declared unholy by the highest authority on earth. And yet, they stood firm together against the Church. In the medieval world, to marry without papal approval was not merely a social risk, it was spiritual rebellion. Excommunication was no idle threat. It meant damnation, exclusion from the sacraments, a death without burial, a soul lost to purgatory. For rulers, it could also mean political suicide. Nobles could rebel, allies could scatter, and legitimacy could vanish in a puff of incense smoke. But William had never been one to flinch, and Matilda, for all her courtly grace, was equally iron beneath the silk. Still, the strain of their defiance pressed heavily on their early years of marriage. Their court in Normandy buzzed with whispers. Could their children be considered rightful heirs? Would the Church seek to nullify their union? Was the future of the duchy, even of William's ambitions beyond the sea, already tainted? Matilda bore it with stoicism, but not silence. In her private chambers in Bruges and later in Caen, where the wind hummed through tapestries and the scent of candle wax clung to the air, she and her ladies spoke of the Pope's ban not with fear, but with careful calculation. Every child she birthed was another argument for permanence. Every year their union endured was a quiet rebellion, stitched into the very fabric of their growing legacy. Eventually, even Rome could not ignore what had become inevitable. This marriage, though born in controversy, had grown into one of substance. By 1059, the Church relented. Pope Nicholas II, after negotiations and gestures of piety, granted a papal dispensation. The union was sanctified retroactively, but effectively, it was a triumph not only for William's political machine but for Matilda's unwavering dignity. They had not begged for mercy. They had negotiated for recognition. As part of the penance, they commissioned the construction of 2 magnificent abbeys in Caen. The Abbey of Saint-Étienne, for men, and the Abbey of Sainte-Trinité, for women. These were no mere acts of apology, they were monuments. Towers of stone rising from penance and pride alike, housing prayers that echoed through time. In the stained glass windows and carved capitals of these churches, Matilda's name endures. Her abbey, Saint Trinité, became a refuge for noblewomen and a testament to her faith, her intellect, and her subtle, enduring power. She gave William not just a dynasty, but a reputation. And in 1066, when William set his sights across the English Channel, it was Matilda who ruled Normandy in his absence. Not as a placeholder, not as a steward, but as a duchess with full authority. Her seal ratified charters. Her word commanded loyalty. Her regency was not questioned, because by then, her authority had become unquestionable. When William returned, crowned King of England, he had conquered a realm. But Matilda had already conquered Normandy's heart. Their marriage, once condemned by the Church, now stood at the center of two united realms, a living testament to defiance transformed into destiny. And yet, the early shadows never entirely disappeared. In their private quarrels, especially over their son Robert, there were echoes of the old unease. Tensions flared not from politics, but from deep, buried fears. What had begun as a marriage under siege had become a crucible, and even iron, when forged too hot, can crack. Still, Matilda's greatest legacy was not merely surviving this pressure but shaping it. She turned suspicion into reverence, a papal curse into a sacred dynasty. Her abbey in Caen would be her final resting place. A queen who once faced the wrath of Rome with a calm gaze and a steady spine, buried beneath stone walls she herself commissioned, where prayers still rise like incense and history bows its head. In the grand halls of Normandy, where banners once fluttered in triumph and the hearths roared with the news of England's conquest, silence had begun to settle like dust. It was not the hush of peace, but the quiet of distance between a husband and wife, long bound by politics and war, and between a mother and the son who had once been her joy. Matilda of Flanders was no stranger to power. She had ruled in her husband's absence, held court, issued charters, and governed with a level of authority few women in Europe could match. But in her later years, as the lines of age crept gently across her face, it was not statecraft that consumed her but sorrow. The marriage that had begun in defiance had matured into something both formidable and fraught. Matilda and William, though united in ambition, were divided by grief. Their eldest son, Robert, nicknamed Curthose for his short legs, had grown into a proud and restless young man. Brave, bold, and deeply insecure, he was everything his father could not control. As William's conquests expanded and his crown grew heavier, Robert demanded a place in it all, not as a child, but as a man, a prince deserving of land and recognition. William resisted. Matilda intervened. She had always been close to Robert, perhaps too close for William's liking. She understood his hunger not just for power, but for dignity. And when he rebelled against his father, raising arms and seeking alliances, it was Matilda who, quietly and perhaps desperately, sent him aid, gold, letters, a mother's hope disguised as political diplomacy. When William discovered the truth, his fury knew no restraint. Chroniclers say the confrontation between them was thunderous. Two rulers, two spouses, clashing not over a battlefield, but over their child. For Matilda, it was not just political betrayal. It was heartbreak. She had spent her life managing alliances, calming egos, smoothing over the jagged edges of her husband's temper, but she could not reconcile a king's fury with a mother's compassion. After Robert's failed revolt, the damage was done. William never fully forgave either of them. The quarrel marked the beginning of an emotional estrangement that neither crown nor chapel could mend. They lived apart more frequently. Their letters grew colder. The woman who had once ruled Normandy in his name, who had birthed his dynasty and held his trust, now found herself alone in the very courts she had built. In 1083, at the Abbey of Saint Trinité in Caen, the church she had raised from scandal and stone, Matilda took to her sickbed. The walls were cool with sea air, the chants of nuns echoing faintly through the cloisters. The scent of lavender still lingered, a soft memory of youth and home. In her final days, Matilda confessed, not to treason perhaps, but to doubt, to sorrow, to the weight of a life lived under titles that often obscured the soul beneath. She died on the 2nd of November, 1083, surrounded not by fanfare, but by silence. William was shattered. The chronicles describe a man unmoored, pacing, cursing, weeping. The conqueror of England, the duke who had defied popes and rivals alike, broken by the death of the only person who had ever truly stood beside him as an equal. He never remarried. 4 years later, he too would die, alone and aching, his empire beginning to fracture under the weight of its own glory. Matilda was laid to rest in the abbey she had founded, her body wrapped in the simple cloth of a duchess, not a queen. Her tomb would be opened centuries later, disturbed by war and revolution, but her legacy remained intact. She had ruled beside a king. She had birthed an empire. But she had also paid the price with a fractured family, a grieving heart, and a final breath taken not on a throne, but in the quiet shadow of a cathedral she had built with love, prayer, and defiance. The Seine moved slowly that winter, its waters thick with ice and fog, while within the limestone halls of the Louvre, a girl was being groomed for destiny. Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV, known across Europe as Philip the Fair, was born into opulence, strategy, and quiet steel. Her childhood unfolded in the grandeur of the Capetian court, beneath painted ceilings and between corridors that smelled of sandalwood, old parchment, and powdered rose petals. But beneath the surface beauty, politics churned. France and England stood once again on the edge of conflict, their long-standing feud over Gascony turning bitter, and Isabella, not yet a teenager, was chosen as the balm. In 1307, when Isabella was around 12, negotiations began. Her marriage to Edward II of England was not born from affection, but from necessity, a political maneuver to tie two ancient enemies into reluctant alliance. She was to become the Queen of England, an ambassador in a bridal gown, a child entrusted with the fate of two kingdoms. In January 1308, her ship crossed the Channel, slicing through cold winds and grey waves, arriving at Boulogne-sur-Mer with sails snapping like banners of conquest. Her body was small, still childlike, swaddled in layers of brocade and expectation. The wedding took place on the 25th of January, in the town's cathedral. The nave was thick with incense, the eyes of French and English nobles fixed on the altar, watching as the delicate girl pledged herself to a man 11 years her senior. Edward II was handsome, tall, with auburn hair and the regal bearing of a Plantagenet. But where others saw a king, Isabella saw something far more dangerous, a man in love with someone else. The first humiliation came not in private, but before the world. At the wedding feast, it was not Isabella who sat at Edward's side, bathed in attention and gifts. Instead, the king's affections turned toward another man, Piers Gaveston, his Gascon favourite, elevated to peerage, adorned with riches, and seated in the place of honour. To Isabella's family, it was a disgrace. To her, it was a wound. Her uncle, angered beyond measure, nearly stormed out of the celebrations. Courtiers whispered behind raised goblets, their eyes flickering between the slighted bride and the smug companion beside her groom. This was no accident, it was a declaration. Isabella had crossed a stormy sea to be wed, only to find herself eclipsed at her own coronation. That night, when the torches dimmed and the wedding chamber was prepared, there was no poetry, no tender gestures, only the motions demanded by custom. The bedding ceremony unfolded as ritual, priests blessing the bed, servants observing from behind veils, courtiers offering goblets of hippocras with hollow toasts to fertility. But the warmth was missing. Chronicles do not describe the intimacy of that night, but they note the chill. Whether consummated or not, the union was already marked by absence. Edward's body may have shared the bed, but his affections remained elsewhere. For Isabella, the loneliness was instant, the fear familiar. She had been trained to expect obedience and restraint, but nothing in her lessons could have prepared her for rejection. She was 12, a bride, a queen, and already an afterthought. In the weeks that followed, her position grew increasingly fragile. Without a pregnancy, her worth was questioned. Her body became the subject of whispers, watched, judged, prodded by expectation. Edward lavished gifts upon Gaveston, ignoring Isabella's growing isolation. She lived among courtiers who feigned allegiance while privately mocking the queen whose husband had another consort in all but name. The humiliation was not just emotional, it was political. France had sent a princess. England had returned an insult. Yet, Isabella did not cry. Not publicly, not yet. In the firelit halls of Westminster, beneath stone arches and stained glass, she learned how to wait, how to listen, how to remember. Because Isabella would not remain silent forever. Her story, like Matilda's and Eleanor's before her, was only beginning, and the girl they ignored would one day become the queen who struck down a king. The crown sat lightly on her head, but the weight of England pressed heavy on her shoulders. Isabella, the daughter of kings, had come to her new realm with dignity, bearing gifts of alliance and silks stitched with lilies. But in Edward's court, she found herself not a queen, but a shadow. Her husband's devotion to Piers Gaveston did not fade, it deepened. Edward raised him high, granting him titles, lands, and access to the royal treasury. Gaveston flaunted his power with insolent charm, mocking the old nobility and eclipsing Isabella at every court occasion. Nobles seethed, but it was Isabella who burned in silence. In portraits and poetry, she was called the she-wolf, but in these early years, she was more ghost than beast, drifting through courtly rituals, smiling when needed, speaking only when summoned. Her body was her battlefield now. Every month that passed without signs of pregnancy fed fresh rumors. Courtiers speculated in whispers about the marriage bed. Did Edward touch her at all? Did he try and fail? Or was Gaveston always between them, even when he wasn't in the room? But queens had no luxury of excuses. The realm needed an heir. Eventually, under mounting pressure, Isabella bore a child, Edward of Windsor, born in 1312 at Windsor Castle, a triumph, a son, a future king. For a moment, her position solidified. She was the mother of the heir, and Edward, to his credit, celebrated the birth. But even then, the warmth was fleeting. Gaveston was soon exiled, recalled, and ultimately killed by angry nobles in 1312. His death was a turning point for Edward, but not in the way Isabella might have hoped. Instead of drawing closer to his wife, he turned to new favourites. First, Hugh Despencer the elder, then his son, Hugh Despencer the younger. If Gaveston had been arrogance cloaked in charm, the Despensers were cruelty dressed as policy. The younger Despencer wormed his way into the king's affections and soon held near absolute influence over royal decisions. Edward became increasingly erratic, paranoid, and vindictive under his counsel. Together, they enriched themselves, crushed rivals, and used Isabella as a pawn to gather more power. She was sent on diplomatic missions, paraded before the people, even made to plead for calm during riots, but her voice carried no weight in council. Behind closed doors, she was ignored. Worse, she was surveilled. The Despensers knew she was dangerous, if not yet defiant. Her French blood, her alliance to a foreign crown, her lineage all made her a threat, and so, they chipped away at her power. Her lands were seized, her income restricted, her allies exiled. Even her children were removed from her care, placed instead under royal and Despencer control. She lived in gilded captivity, a queen in name only. And yet, she watched. She remembered. In 1325, Edward sent her to France to negotiate peace over Gascony, an echo of her father's old war. It was a mission the Despensers expected her to complete and return from in quiet obedience, but Isabella did not return. In Paris, free from their reach, she reclaimed herself. She refused to come home. Citing the Despensers' tyranny, she claimed she feared for her life, and in the shadows of the French court, she began to plot. With the help of an exiled nobleman, Roger Mortimer, she raised a rebellion not from the saddle of war, but from the careful strokes of ink and whispered promises. She summoned her son, the young Edward, to her side. She gathered mercenaries, support, and steel, and then, in 1326, she invaded. The queen who had once been cast aside as a girl now returned as a fury incarnate. The Despensers fell captured, executed, erased. Edward II fled, was captured, and was forced to abdicate. His crown passed to his son. His freedom, and later his life, were quietly extinguished, and Isabella ruled for 4 brief, burning years as Regent of England. But it had begun in a cold wedding bed, where a child bride lay awake beside a king who would not see her. The ignored queen had become the architect of revolution. She had arrived in England as a bride, a girl of 12, cloaked in velvet and expectation. She had borne humiliation, silence, and the cold neglect of a husband who saw her more as ornament than partner. But now, Isabella of France stood atop the throne she had once merely decorated. In 1327, with her son crowned as Edward III, Isabella ruled as regent alongside her lover and ally, Roger Mortimer. For 4 years, they held the kingdom in their grip, not as temporary caretakers, but as sovereigns in all but name. Gone was the quiet queen, sidelined at feasts and stripped of dignity. In her place was a ruler who wore command like a second skin. But power, as she well knew, is never unchallenged. At first, the English people welcomed her victory. The fall of the Despensers had been a bloody relief, and Edward II's deposition felt like justice. Isabella moved quickly to stabilize the court, reward her allies, and tighten her hold on the treasury and titles once denied her. Mortimer, though officially only the Earl of March, acted with kingly authority, issuing decrees, enriching himself, and growing increasingly arrogant, and the young king, Isabella's son, watched. Edward III, only 14 at the time of his coronation, was not yet old enough to rule independently. But he was his mother's son and his father's heir. He had inherited the iron will of the Plantagenets and the cunning of the French court, and he did not forget how his mother had overthrown a king. In 1330, now 17, Edward III acted. With the help of trusted allies, he orchestrated a quiet coup. Roger Mortimer was seized in the middle of the night, dragged from his bed, tried in haste, and hanged at Tyburn. No royal burial, no honours, just a traitor's death. And Isabella? He spared her life, but not her reign. Stripped of her power, she was confined to Castle Rising in Norfolk. Not a prison, not quite exile, but a place of elegant seclusion. She remained there for years, visited occasionally, her influence extinguished, her image recast. No longer the regent, no longer the lioness of rebellion, just the she-wolf in her den. And yet, even in this quiet, Isabella was not broken. She dressed with regal precision. She read. She prayed. She walked her gardens as if they were courts. History might have sidelined her, but she understood better than anyone that silence could still speak volumes. She died on the 22nd of August, 1358, in her early 60s. At her request, she was buried at the Greyfriars Church in London, wearing the habit of a Franciscan nun, and beside her, she asked that they lay the heart of her late husband Edward II, a gesture of penance, of politics, or perhaps, in the complexity of love and betrayal, something more ambiguous, a final reclaiming of a man she had once dethroned, whose neglect had forged her will. Isabella had been many things: princess, bride, queen, mother, rebel, regent, but above all, she was a woman who refused to vanish. History remembers her harshly, often unfairly, through the eyes of the men she dethroned or defied. But look closer, and you see her not as a villain, but as a survivor, one who refused to be ignored, who fought not just for herself, but for her son, her crown, her name. Her wedding night had offered her humiliation, but her life answered back with thunder. The vineyards of Anjou ripened under the spring sun, their vines heavy with promise. In this land of soft hills and richer courts, Margaret of Anjou was born on the 23rd of March, 1430, a daughter of the House of Valois, niece to the King of France, and a child destined to be a peace offering. Her world was one of refinement, culture, and rising danger. France was still bleeding from the 100 Years' War, and England, though weary, held firm to its continental claims. Her father, René of Anjou, was a man of many titles and few crowns. Her mother, Isabella of Lorraine, was ambitious, educated, and fiercely protective. They raised Margaret with more than silk and scripture. They gave her purpose. By the age of 15, Margaret was a jewel in Europe's political chessboard. But this jewel came with a price. In 1444, a truce between England and France was negotiated, fragile, brittle, and desperately needed. At its heart was a marriage proposal. Margaret to wed King Henry VI of England, a man 10 years her senior, a king known more for prayer than power. Her dowry was modest, only 20,000 francs, a small sum for so grand a match. In return, England agreed to the cession of Maine to the French, a controversial decision that would haunt Margaret's reign. But for now, she was the vessel of peace. On the 9th of April, 1445, Margaret arrived in England at Portsmouth. The crowd gathered to welcome her. The salty tang of the Solent carried on the breeze, mingling with the trumpet fanfare and the murmur of expectations. She stepped ashore in silks and dignity, her dark hair threaded with pearls, her youth a promise to a nation desperate for hope. The wedding took place on the 23rd of April at Titchfield Abbey in Hampshire, a quiet Cistercian house shrouded in spring mist. There were no grand cathedrals, no roaring bells, only solemn vows beneath a vaulted ceiling, the air filled with the scent of beeswax and wild herbs. Margaret stood beside Henry VI, a gentle and pious figure with eyes that looked past her, as if always toward heaven. He was 23, kind, devout, and tragically fragile. She was 15, clever, poised, and unprepared for what came next. At the feast that followed, sugar sculptures of lions and eagles adorned the tables. Courtiers raised goblets of hippocras, sweet with spice, to toast the future of the realm. But beneath the surface, dissent brewed. The marriage had been orchestrated by William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, a man viewed with deep suspicion by the nobility. His secret negotiation to surrender Maine in exchange for Margaret's hand had enraged many. Margaret, barely aware of the storm she was walking into, found herself already a target. That night, in the guest quarters of the abbey, their wedding bed was prepared. The sheets had been blessed. Herbs, rosemary, sage, lavender were scattered beneath the mattress to ward off evil spirits and encourage fertility. But Margaret's fears were not of spirits. She was in a foreign land, married to a king who barely spoke, whose soft touch betrayed a mind already fraying under the weight of divine expectation. Henry was not cruel. He was kind, achingly so, but kindness cannot bear crowns alone. His world was made of scripture and visions, of saints and sermons. Margaret needed a protector. Instead, she found herself already alone. There is no record of what passed between them that night. No witnesses, no scandals, only silence. But in that silence, something broke. Months passed. No pregnancy came. Whispers swirled. Was the king impotent? Was the queen barren? Was the peace they embodied already beginning to unravel? Margaret clung to duty. She learned English customs, navigated court factions, and played the part of the queen with grace. But she also listened. She watched. She understood, quickly and with growing dread, that she would have to fight not just for her place, but for her husband's crown. She was no longer a bride of peace. She was becoming a queen of war. 8 years passed before Margaret of Anjou finally held in her arms what the realm had demanded since her wedding night, a son. Edward of Westminster was born on the 13th of October, 1453, at Westminster Palace. His cry echoed through the royal chambers like the tolling of a long-awaited bell. And yet, even in that moment of triumph, shadows closed in. The King Henry VI was absent, not in body, but in mind. Just weeks before the birth, Henry had succumbed to a catatonic collapse. He spoke to no one. He did not recognize his wife. He made no acknowledgement of his heir. The Queen had borne a prince, but the father was lost to silence. Whispers exploded across the kingdom. Who was the child's true father? Could a man in such a state have conceived an heir? Names were tossed about in private corners. Edmund Beaufort, the Duke of Somerset, one of Margaret's few allies. The accusations were never proven, never said aloud by anyone who valued their head, but they clung to her reputation like smoke. Margaret, newly crowned as mother of the heir, now ruled in all but name. When Henry's condition did not improve, a protectorate was established led not by the Queen, but by Richard, Duke of York, a man with royal blood, ambition, and growing support. A man who many believed should wear the crown himself. Margaret, watching from the shadows of council chambers, felt the weight of power slipping from her fingers. She would not allow it. When Henry briefly recovered in late 1454, Margaret struck. She had him dismiss York as protector and reassert her influence. The kingdom would not fall into the hands of her husband's cousin, not while she still breathed. The tension between Margaret and York exploded into civil war in 1455. The Wars of the Roses. Red rose against white, Lancaster against York, and Margaret, no longer just a consort, became the living symbol of her house. She raised armies, she forged alliances, she rode into battle camps, spoke before soldiers, negotiated with mercenaries, and outmaneuvered lords twice her age. The girl who had once feared the unknown beneath her wedding veil now stood beneath banners soaked in rain and blood. But war takes everything, even from those who command it. In 1460, York's forces captured King Henry. Margaret fled with her son, moving from castle to castle, clinging to safety and vengeance. At the Battle of Wakefield, York was slain, his head crowned in mockery and displayed on a pike. Margaret ordered it herself. It was not mercy she offered, it was justice. But retribution is fleeting. In 1461, at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, Margaret's army was crushed. She and young Edward fled again, this time into exile. Her throne was lost, her husband once again captured, her son growing in bitterness. But Margaret was not yet defeated. She found allies in France and Scotland. She struck new bargains, and in 1470, she returned to England at the head of another rebellion. The tides turned. Henry VI was briefly restored to the throne, and then disaster. At the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471, Margaret's forces were broken for the last time. Her son, her long-awaited prince, her answer to a nation's prayers was cut down. Some say in battle, others whisper he was executed after capture. She never saw him die, but she felt it, deep and permanent, in her bones. Margaret was taken prisoner. Her husband, Henry VI, was murdered in the Tower that same year. Her life, the battles, the sacrifices, the crown was gone. In 1475, after years in captivity, she was ransomed back to France. She lived out her final days in relative obscurity, penniless and alone, dying on the 25th of August, 1482, at Dampierre-sur-Loire. But the memory of her remained. She was the queen who led armies, who stood against nobles and kings alike, who bled for a son and a crown that refused to hold. Her story did not end in victory, but neither did it end in silence. It began on a wedding night, with fear and uncertainty. It ended on a battlefield, beneath banners ripped by wind and war, and between those two moments lived a woman forged in fire. Stone walls remember, long after the laughter of wedding feasts has faded and the banners have been folded away. The chambers where these women once stood remain silent, cold, haunted by the echoes of silk dragging across flagstones and breath caught between fear and duty. Across centuries, from the mist-veiled towers of Normandy to the jeweled courts of England and the incense-laced cathedrals of France, royal brides have entered their wedding nights, not with joy, but with dread, their youth wrapped in velvet, their voices smothered beneath veils, their bodies turned into contracts. They were daughters, handed over like treaties. They were children, crowned before their bones had finished growing. They were queens, but only if their wombs cooperated. Matilda of England crossed the sea at 7, was wed at 12, and sacrificed her childhood to a throne not her own. Eleanor of Aquitaine survived a marriage that smothered her spirit, only to reclaim power in defiance of kings. Matilda of Flanders faced the church to forge a dynasty from scandal. Isabella of France transformed from a silenced bride to a queen who shattered a kingdom. Margaret of Anjou became a warrior in silk, wielding armies in the name of a crown that never welcomed her. Margaret Beaufort's wedding bed became her battlefield, her body torn so that a dynasty could rise. None of them had a choice, and yet each of them chose to survive, to adapt, to endure, to resist, even when resistance was as quiet as a locked door or a withheld smile. Even when it came through silence, through the bearing of sons, through the mastering of court whispers and the careful, lethal placement of alliances, they lived in a world where a woman's worth was measured in heirs, where a wedding night could be the first step toward a coffin. Yet through pain, through humiliation, through blood and betrayal, they carved space for themselves within the iron architecture of power. History remembers the kings, the warriors, the tyrants, the martyrs, but behind every shifting crown stood a girl who had once stared into the candlelight, clutching the edge of a marriage bed, and whispered a silent prayer, not for love, not even for safety, but for survival, and sometimes survival was enough to shape history. These are not love stories, they are not fairy tales, they are stories of endurance, raw, brutal, and true. They remind us that behind every coronation lies a chamber, behind every alliance a sacrifice, and behind every crown, the quiet shadow of a girl no one bothered to ask, but whose heartbeat echoed long after the bells stopped ringing. Completed.